Hey everyone, today we are starting to talk about the Vietnam War. The war in Vietnam can be really complicated and really hard to understand, so this first lecture is really just going to be about the terminology that we use to discuss this war, and about who is on which side, and basically just setting up the rest of the war, which you'll get in the second lecture. The United States is going to back South Vietnam. Theoretically, South Vietnam is a democratic country, and they are facing a threat from a communist country, North Vietnam. So the United States is going to be allied with South Vietnam. All of the terms we're about to talk about are associated with our allies in this war or American military. The RVN is the official name of South Vietnam. That's the Republic of Vietnam. They are going to call themselves a republic even though they do not really have an elected leader. So this is President No Dinh Diem. No Dinh Diem is Western educated. He's a Catholic. I want you guys to notice how he's dressed. He's in a suit and tie. This is as close to a Westerner in South Vietnam as we're going to get. He is put into place by the French, and we are going to try to keep him in power. ARVN is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. This is the official army of South Vietnam. When we first go to Vietnam, our goal is to train ARVN. So in the 1950s, when we're in Vietnam, Eisenhower says the goal is not to fight the war for them. Our goal is to make sure that ARVN is strong enough to withstand an attack from the north. No Dinh Diem is not a very good leader. He's not the kind of person we probably want to be an ally with. And so he is going to use a secret police force called the Can Lao. The Can Lao is led by his brother, No Dinh Diem. And in particular, the Can Lao is known for attacks on Buddhist monks, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Early on in our intervention to Vietnam, we do not refer to the Americans who are in Vietnam as soldiers. If we call them soldiers, then this is a war. So instead, the Americans that are in Vietnam to train ARVN are the MACVs, the Military Assistance Command of Vietnam. So MACVs are Americans. Their role is something similar to like a drill sergeant. Their role is to get ARVN ready and prepared to fight their own war. In the north, we're going to have Ho Chi Minh as the leader of the DRV. The DRV is the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. We talked about this before when we talked about Korea, but whenever you see Democratic Republic, you should know that that signals that this is a communist country. I know it sounds like it's a democracy, but Democratic Republic means communist. The PAVN is the People's Army of Vietnam. So the PAVN is an official army. They have ranks, they wear uniforms, they're a legitimate military force. If you're watching a movie about the Vietnam War from the American perspective, you will almost never see the PAVN. We do engage with the PAVN, we do have contact with them, we fight with them, but we're not as concerned about them because we understand how to fight a legitimate army. What is much harder for us to deal with is the NLF. This is the National Liberation Front. The NLF is an insurgency group. They're in the north, but they're also primarily in the south. They do not wear uniforms. They do not have an official hierarchy. Women and children can work for the NLF. When we watch Vietnam movies, if you hear in the movie the VC is surrounding us, or the Viet Cong are around us, or Charlie is around us, usually they are referring to the National Liberation Front. It took us several years in this war to understand that the PAVN and the NLF are actually two separate organizations, that they are completely and totally different. Both of them look to Ho Chi Minh as their leader, but they operate differently, their structure is different, and to end this war, we're going to have to bring representatives of both the PAVN and the NLF to negotiate. We can't negotiate with either one or the other, it has to be both. The best modern example I have of something like this is when we talk about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Sometimes they worked together and sometimes they had the same goals and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes their leadership overlapped, sometimes it didn't. We really should think of these as two separate organizations. Just like with Korea, we're going to have some geographic terms here we need to know. The 17th parallel is the dividing line between North and South Vietnam. The 17th parallel is an artificial border. So what we mean by that is there's not a river, a lake, a mountain there. There's no geographic reason for a barrier. There is also not a cultural, religious, language barrier there. North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese people are one group until we get to 1945 and we see that dividing line at the end of World War II. 2.5 miles on either side of the 17th parallel is the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. There is no reason for anyone to be in the DMZ, so if you're there, you're likely to be shot because you would be considered a spy or that you're transporting goods or services across the line and you can't do that. So because of the 17th parallel and the DMZ, the PAVN, the Army in the North, has trouble sometimes getting supplies to the NLF, the insurgency group in the South. So to get supplies from the North to the South, they are going to use the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When we talk about Vietnam, we often talk about how the American Army was the most sophisticated, the most powerful, the most advanced technologically in the world. And yet, we cannot defeat this country that has not even a tenth of our resources. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is a good example of this. Throughout the entirety of the Vietnam War, we never shut the Ho Chi Minh Trail down for more than 24 hours. And the reason for that is that this is not a high-tech trail, it's a walking trail through a jungle. When we enter into Vietnam, Congress put very specific limits on what our presidents and the military were allowed to do. So one thing that's established pretty early on is that we can only bomb within the confines of Vietnam. So North Vietnam figured that out very quickly. And if you look at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it goes into Laos, it goes into Cambodia, so that it won't be bombed. And then it dips back into South Vietnam. If the trail ever is bombed, because it's not a paved trail, because it's not bridges, because it's not really considered infrastructure, the people on the trail would just walk around where it had been bombed. If I'm walking on a trail and there's a crater in the trail, I just walk around the crater. So this is very low technology, but we don't have a way to stop it. In looking at South Vietnam and the government that we choose to ally ourselves with, Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Nhu Dinh Diem launch a campaign through the Can Lao specifically targeting Buddhists. They see Buddhism as a threat to their rule and also as a threat to further westernization of Vietnam. Because Buddhists are being targeted by the government in South Vietnam, we're going to see a series of protests that involve self-immolation. So what you're seeing in this picture is a monk who has assumed a prayer position. Then another monk will douse him in gasoline, and he lights himself on fire. The monk engaged in this protest very often is going to die in the process of this protest, but what it does is it attracts Western attention. This is a picture taken by a reporter who's in South Vietnam. So if you see this kind of an act, you are going to look into this movement. It's going to raise a lot of questions for you. Why would somebody be willing to do this to themselves? It must be very bad if this is what they're going to result in. And something else that really impacts us in the West is that when we see this type of a protest, and that monk is so dedicated to what he's doing, he's able to maintain that prayer position while he's burning. This is enough to make at least some people in the United States question why we have allied ourselves with Ngo Dinh Diem. As we are further and further into the Vietnam War, we're going to go through a series of strategies and tactics. And the two men that we primarily have responsible for this are going to be General William Westmoreland. He's our general on the ground in command of Vietnam. And then Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara is our Secretary of Defense. Before he comes to work for the Kennedy administration, Robert McNamara works for a car company. And in his mind, if you want to make more cars, you hire more workers. So he's going to use that same kind of logic to apply it to a war. If we want to win the war, we get more soldiers. It is very hard to determine at any point if we're actually winning this war, and so our strategies and tactics do change quite a bit. So early on when we go into Vietnam, we talk about winning hearts and minds. For people that have grown up in communal rice farming villages, words like democracy and communism don't necessarily carry the same weight that they do with us. And so when we are trying to convince the population of South Vietnam to stick out this war, to fight with us, to resist communism, the only way to do that is to win over their hearts and minds. We have to appeal to them to make them think that democracy is better than communism. The idea of winning over hearts and minds is difficult. It's hard to do, especially if you don't understand the culture that you're going into. And so we fairly quickly abandon the idea of hearts and minds and we move on to search and destroy. Our soldiers would go into a village. They would not be able to tell who is just a villager and who is part of the NLF. And so new orders became search and destroy. Go into the village, search for members of the NLF, and when you leave, burn the village down. Search and destroy. The idea there is even if the NLF had been in the village, when you leave and you burn it down, you're using a scorched earth tactic. You're taking away any resources or potential resources that your enemy would have had. The problem with search and destroy is that it's the direct opposite of winning hearts and minds. If I wasn't an enemy of the US, but then you come and burn my house down, you have now forced me to become an enemy of the US. So search and destroy actually creates more enemies than it helps us to find enemies. In the 1960s, we start looking for a way to measure success in Vietnam. This is a different kind of war for us. In most wars we've had before Vietnam, there's an objective. So in the Mexican-American War, we need to get to Mexico City. In World War II, we need to get to Berlin. With Vietnam, the goal is never to take over North Vietnam, so we don't have a way to measure geographically if we're winning this war. So instead, we're going to turn to a war of attrition. A war of attrition is a body count war. If at the end of the day, we have killed 10 and they have killed 7, we won for today. So commanders in the field in Vietnam are told to take very careful counts of how many enemy soldiers are killed. There are a number of problems with this. The first is just human error. If we are in a village and there's a firefight and you're the commander and you have to count the dead, well, the NLF aren't wearing uniforms. So it becomes difficult to count who was actually an enemy combatant and who was a civilian. Most commanders, whether it's out of abundance of caution or to make their units look good, they're going to count any dead Vietnamese as a member of the NLF. So we have some commanders counting the death of a 1-year-old child as an enemy combatant death. We have some commanders that are counting 90-year-old men as enemy combatant deaths. Those probably shouldn't really be counted. The other thing that the war of attrition does, it encourages career military men to inflate the numbers. If this is how we're judging the success of my unit, and if we legitimately killed 15 enemy combatants, maybe I write down 20. Maybe I write down 25. The last thing a war of attrition does is it encourages indiscriminate killing. If we're basing all of this on numbers and body counts, then you have a built-in incentive to kill more people than you do to win their hearts and minds. So to have a war of attrition is just generally a bad strategy. Members of our Marine Corps are going to engage in a tactic called SLAM. This is first developed in the Civil War. It's a pretty effective strategy, but it takes a long time to get effective at doing it. So what members of the Marines would do is they would seek the enemy, locate the enemy, annihilate the enemy, monitor the enemy. SLAM. Seek, locate, annihilate, monitor. Rather than going into a village like search and destroy and burning down the whole village, SLAM is much more targeted. You're looking for legitimate enemy combatants and you are only targeting them. The problem with SLAM is that it takes a while to really get good at it, to be able to tell the difference between an enemy and not an enemy, and to be able to target and locate them and then monitor them effectively. In Vietnam, because we are drafting some of our soldiers and because they don't necessarily want to be there, they have not signed up for this, you have a 12-month term of service. So at the end of 12 months, your tour is done. For our Marines, this means every 12 months they're having to retrain people to do SLAM. So by the time you get good at it, you're probably going to be shipped home. All right, and the last two terms are strategies for how we fought the war as a whole. When we feel like South Vietnam is not effectively fighting their own war, we're going to use the strategy of Americanization. So we sent American troops into the war. When the political will for this war wears out at home, when we start seeing high protests, when we want everybody back, we see Vietnamization. We pull the Americans out of the war and tell South Vietnam to fight their own fight. So Americanization gets us in, Vietnamization gets us out. As far as weapons of war, we have two new ones we need to talk about during Vietnam. So during Operation Ranch Hand, we dropped Agent Orange across about 30% of Vietnam. What you're seeing in this map is all of the places in orange that Agent Orange was dropped. Agent Orange is designed as an herbicide. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam by tonnage than we did in all of World War II. The problem in Vietnam is that there's a very thick, heavy jungle, so we would bomb, but we couldn't see what we were bombing. Agent Orange is sprayed to kill the vegetation, so then we can see if we're hitting our targets. As an herbicide, Agent Orange is very, very effective. The problem is it wasn't fully studied before we used it. So Agent Orange can sink into the soil, it can sink into water, and it has a life of about 20 years in the environment. Agent Orange leads to a number of birth defects in Vietnam. I've left you an optional link. You can go look at it in our course if you want to. Please know those images are very hard to look at, and so if you want to skip it, I completely and totally understand. The military today says that Agent Orange has correlation, but not causation, with a number of physiological issues, nerve damage being chief among them. The military does not say there's causation between those things, because if they did, they would have to fund a lot more of the healthcare for our veterans than they're willing to fund. Some of you may even know a veteran that was affected by Agent Orange. This is an ongoing issue. All right, and then the next weapon we're going to talk about is napalm. Napalm is a gasoline-based jelly. So when you fire a bomb with napalm, it sticks to the skin and it reacts to oxygen. This is a pretty famous picture of a napalm attack. So you can see that these children have been hit by napalm. The girl, especially in the middle, has been hit. To the credit of these soldiers, there is not much they can do for her at that exact moment. But when you see a picture like this and you see a child obviously in pain and hurt, you want our soldiers to be doing something for her. You can see here sort of the after effect of the napalm attack and how this girl's skin is just literally peeling off. The girl that was attacked by napalm is now a speaker, and so she travels and talks about what her experience was like in the war, what her experience was like to be a war refugee, and she's an activist now for other refugees. All right, then finally today we're going to talk about political terms of the war. So the first two you should already be pretty familiar with. These are the two ideologies that get us into Vietnam: domino theory and containment. Our goal in the Cold War is to contain communism. So in this case, contain it to North Vietnam. If we fail to contain communism, we're going to see the dominoes start falling, which is the domino theory. If we lose South Vietnam, we'll lose Laos, we'll lose Cambodia. So containment and the domino theory get us into Vietnam. The credibility gap is the difference between what you can see with your own eyes versus what the government is telling you. I know this is hard to believe, but before the Vietnam War, we generally believed that our government told us the truth. If the president said something, we thought we could believe it. So several times during the Vietnam War, a president goes on television and says we're winning this war, and then I watch the nightly news and I see dead Americans. And that doesn't feel like we're winning. So the credibility gap is the difference between what the government tells you and what you see, feel, observe with your own eyes. We often refer to Vietnam as a quagmire. Another word for quagmire is quicksand. It's easy to get into it, it's hard to get out of it. Once we are in Vietnam, we don't know how to leave. Alright, so that's it for terminology for Vietnam. You should be ready to go on and listen to the actual progression of the war, but if you have questions about any of these terms, please let me know.